Hi, my name is Kelsey from Just Sew and Story Hill Designs, and this video is meant to accompany my free pattern called Shirley's Flower Garden that is available for download in the description below. I'm just going to use this video to walk you through my method of how I made this quilt, because honestly, the biggest part about making this quilt is keeping yourself organized. And so I wanted to show you my process as I assembled all of my rows and assembled the quilt as a whole, because unlike most quilts, this is not making blocks at a time and then putting all of the blocks together into rows like a lot of quilts are. This one instead uses a bunch of tiny half square triangles. So the best part about this pattern is that you don't have any Y seams, which is typically what you get when you're making some sort of hexagon quilt, usually some variation on a grandmother's flower garden. So this one, because we're using half hexagons, you can actually assemble it by rows. And so we don't have any of those Y seams, and this process went so quickly for me. So I wanted to show you guys how I kind of organized myself for this project, and then you can also download the pattern and use this video and the pattern to kind of walk you through how to make this quilt. So first things first, you will definitely need this ruler. This is Moda's Project Jelly Roll half hexagon template ruler. So this whole project was inspired by this template. It is 2.5 inches wide here, so it's meant to be used with a jelly roll. So jelly rolls are pre-cut 2.5 inch strips, and so my quilt includes printed fabrics from a jelly roll and then a background fabric that I myself cut into 2.5 inch strips. So you'll want this plus a printed jelly roll plus your background fabric. Now your background fabric can be solid jelly rolls. They do make that. If you want your background to be a solid, you might as well look around for a solid jelly roll so that it's already cut. However, if you can't find a jelly roll in the background fabric that you want, you'll just have to get yardage according to the pattern, and then cut it yourself into 2.5 inch strips, and then subcut your strips using this ruler. I also liked to cut using my rotating cutting mat. I just felt like this helped because I needed to, once I cut one side, I would rotate it and then cut the other side. And one quick note about this ruler is that it does have its corners cut off right here. And at first I thought that wouldn't be that big of a deal, so I just kind of sloppily chopped those corners off. However, as I've sewn this quilt together, I realized that these are actually your 1/4 inch seam, and so it actually is nice to cut this as precisely as you can, because that will help you not have any bulk in your seams. But if you do kind of cut those a little sloppily, that is okay. You can kind of ease it in there, but that is kind of a good guideline to have. So try to keep these cuts as precise as possible as you're cutting out. And then you'll also need your center fabric. For your center, the centers of your flowers, I do suggest a contrasting fabric, so a color that's not very dominant in the rest of the design. So I think something like a solid white or a white on white is what I used, would be great. However, depending on your colors, maybe a different color would be good. Okay, so I suggest once you have all of your fabric cut, you're gonna wanna do your floor layout. Now, my floor layout actually took me like 4 hours. And the reason for this is because typically when you're doing a floor layout, you've made all of your blocks, and all you have to do is lay your blocks down and then rearrange them however you want. However, because this quilt is made up of all of these little half hexagons, you don't have these big blocks to lay out. You have these tiny pieces for quite a large quilt. It does make quite a large quilt, this pattern. And so it did take me a little while, but it's worth taking your time, because the way that you do your floor layout is going to set the course for the rest of your project. So this is a picture of when I laid it out on the floor. And I do suggest taking a pretty good picture of the entire thing where nothing is cut off, because I suggest printing it out. Because you're making so many skinny rows, this is the best way to kind of keep track of your design. So once you lay it all out on the floor according to the diagram and the pattern, with the correct spacing and everything, you'll want to take a good picture and then printed out in quite a large size. This is just a regular printer piece of paper. One quick note about my pattern here is that I didn't have my center fabric yet when I was laying this out. So you'll see the centers of my fabric, or of my flowers, are empty. That's just my rug showing through. So I did later add in my white centers. So if you're thrown off by that, that's why. Just wanted to let you know. But this was very, very helpful for me to stay organized and make sure that I made my rows all perfectly as I laid them out, was to print it off and cross out my rows as I went. So that's my first tip to you, is to print off a picture of your floor layout so that you can stay organized the whole time. Next up, I suggest after you have it all laid out, gather your rows in order and then label them. So here I have row 2, and I did use a wonder clip and like a little post-it note to label it, but you're gonna have 41 rows. So if you don't have 41 wonder clips, you'll want to make sure that you keep your piles separate somehow. So that's something for you to keep in mind. And then use some sort of paper or label to keep all of your rows organized. So I have row 1 and 2. I've gone ahead and sewn all the rest of my rows, and these are the ones I'm going to sew together with you guys today. And then after that, after you have all of your rows finished and your paper printed out, this is when you're going to start sewing. A few quick tips before we get started sewing. I'm not really sure why I did this, but I started from the bottom up. I think it's because the way I had my piles is the 41st row was the most accessible to me, so I just grabbed that one first. So I worked from the bottom up, and what I did is I sewed 10 rows together at a time, because another thing that you have to think about is the direction that you're going to iron all of your seams. So the way that this works out, your seams are going to nest together perfectly so long as each row is ironed in the opposite direction. So what I did was I labeled all of my rows 1 through 41 here, and then as I sewed it, I crossed it out. And then once I had sewn 10 rows together, it will look like this. I had all my rows sewn together here, not ironed, and they're all still labeled. I pinned the label to it. And then what I'm going to show you guys today is how once you have all 10 of your rows sewn together, that's when you're going to look at your paper and one by one, note the direction you're going to iron them with arrows here so that each one is going opposite. So row 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So I wait to iron it until I have 10 rows ready to be sewn together. I iron them one at a time, and then I sew them together so that all of my seams are nesting together. And then by the end of that, I have pieces that look like this. So this is 10 rows all sewn together, and my corners all match up perfectly because my seam allowance is perfect and my seams are all ironed in opposite directions, so they're nesting together. So because there's 41 rows, you're gonna have 4 of these panels by the time you're finished. So I like to keep my labels here. So this is my 21st row and my 12th row right here, so that when I'm ready to sew all 4 of these together, I know which ones are supposed to connect and which way. I hope that all makes sense. So I kind of have all of my different stages here ready to show you guys. I'm going to use these here to show you how to sew together a whole row. And then I'm going to show you how to iron and sew your rows together into a whole strip. And then I'm going to show you how to sew all of your big strips together to complete your whole quilt top. Okay, so have your pile of 1 row over here. I also make sure I have thread snips handy because we'll be snipping apart our chain stitched rows. So I do like to chain stitch. This makes this process super quick. I also have my 1/4 inch patchwork quilt or patchwork foot here with a guide to help me make my 1/4 inches all the same. So we're going to take the first 2 from our pile. Oh, this one. The first 2 from our pile, and they're going to go together with these 2 together. So I'm going to put them right sides together. And here's where you can see what I was saying about these corners that are cut off. That's kind of supposed to be 1/4 of an inch. So if it's not, you'll just have a little bit of that bulk in your seam, but that's fine. So I'm gonna go ahead and stitch this. And it might throw you off a little bit because these are crooked, but once you open it up, it's going to be perfectly flat. So you just kind of have to get used to laying them like that, where the seams are lined up, but the rest of the fabric is not. Just gonna do the same thing over here. And as you can see, I'm not pinning anything. I'm just kind of going with it. And you just wanna make sure you're keeping them all in the correct order as you go. And this is another reason that you have your picture printed off, because it's easy to reference and make sure that you have all of your half hexies in the right order as you go, because as you put your rows together, it's going to form your flowers. So you do need to make sure all of your half hexies are where they're supposed to be. They're facing the right direction and they're in order and everything like that. All right, once you've sewn the last pair together, you should have an even amount in all of your rows, so they go together in even pairs. Then you have them all chain stitched together. Make sure you keep them in order as you cut them apart. So I'm going to snip this last one and put it to the side and keep them in piles, all facing the same direction from the last to the first. Okay, now I have this pile and I know that they're in order. And so I'm going to open it up. You can see how that is starting to form a row. So I open up my first one and then my second one, and they're gonna go together like this. So again, we have to just work with this angled seam right here. Put them on top of each other like this. And go ahead and sew it down. You'll do that for your next couple of pairs. And don't be afraid to reference your photo at any point in this step so that you're making sure that they're all still in order. Okay, once you've sewn together 4 different sets, you'll still have one left over because now there's an odd amount, but that's fine. Just keep this set aside and we will add that in later on. So now I have these, and again, I'm gonna snip them apart and put them in a pile over here so that they're in order. This pattern is mostly just keeping your rows in order. That's one of the biggest parts of this pattern, because you're trying to form complete hexagon flowers with your separate rows. So I found that a big part of this is just keeping yourself organized. And at this point, you'll start to get used to arranging your fabric in this awkward way. Okay, so at this point, you just sewed this whole row together. And what you want to do is just kind of fold it up and grab your label. So this was row 2, and pin your label to it. And set it aside with your other rows. And go ahead and keep sewing all of your rows together, however many you want to do. If you want to do them all at once, that's up to you. Like I said, I like to do them in sets of 10. So obviously one of them will have 11 because there's 41 rows, but the other 3 will have 10. And so I just like to do it like that. And then once I have 10 rows all ready to sew together, I'll show you how we do that. Okay, so now we're over at the ironing board, and starting at the last row that I have ironed, which was row 12, I'm gonna move up from there. So next up I have row 11, and I'm going to press these in opposite directions like I said. So this one was pressed to the left. So 11, I'm not gonna sew 11 and 12 together quite yet, but they will eventually be sewn together. So I'm going to press 11 to the right. So that means I want this pressed this way. So I'm going to turn it to the back and take my iron and press them all that way. Again, try not to stretch this out. Since these are all cut at an angle, it's easier to stretch your fabric. So I like to just tug ever so slightly so that there's tension on my fabric so I don't accidentally iron a fold into it. But you don't want to pull so hard that it stretches it out of shape. Okay, so that's row 11. Now I'm going to iron row 10. 11 was to the right, so 10 is going to be to the left. Okay, so now these rows are going to get sewn together. And this is the fun part when you can start seeing your flower take shape. So these are going to go together. And now you can see, because you press them in the opposite direction, your seams all nest perfectly, and it's really easy to line up all of your seams as you sew this row together. Once I'm done sewing 10 and 11 together, I'm going to go over and I'm going to take row 9 and I'm going to go ahead and press this. I like to press and then sew them together one at a time because that helps me keep track of them. So I'm going to go ahead and press this according to the next direction I have indicated on my paper, and then I'm going to come back over and sew it next to row 10. Okay, I am putting on my last row of this set, and I just wanted to show you guys. This is why I like to do 10 at a time, because otherwise the bulk on this side will build up to be so much that when you're only putting one strip on at a time and you have like 30 over here, it might get too heavy. So this is why I suggest doing 10 at a time, but like I said, you can feel it out and see how you prefer to do it. I'm gonna finish putting this strip on, and then we will combine all 4 sets together. Once you have a whole set ready, I just like to press all of these seams that connect all the rows in one direction. It doesn't really matter because these seams won't be overlapping with anything else, so you don't need to worry about nesting. So just get them nice and flat, and then we will connect all of our parts together. And I love seeing the difference here between the side that is pressed and the side that's not pressed yet. It makes such a huge difference. Okay, so remember how I suggested labeling your last rows of each set so that you remember which one they are? So now we know that this is row 12, and it will come together just like this. So I'm going to go ahead and connect all 4 of my sets together. And here we are. There's the finished product. So cute. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial to go along with my free pattern. So if you haven't done so already, make sure you click the link in the description below to go ahead and download the pattern for this for free. And don't forget that you will also need that 2.5 inch half hexie template as well. I hope this was helpful. Whenever you guys finish your quilts, I would love to see pictures of it. Make sure that you tag me on Instagram at Just Sew Studio, or you can join my Facebook group called Just Sew Along and you can post a picture there as well. Bye!